Good evening. I'm Cheryl Holcomb-McCoy, Dean of the School of Education here at American University. And welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us this evening for our series called Big Ideas in Education. This series really started as a means for us in the School of Education at AU to bring some of the big thinkers and bold leaders to our community, to our school community, for our students, staff, faculty, and community to learn more about pressing issues and innovative strategies for teaching, learning, and leading. In the fall, our series was kicked off by former Secretary of Education, John King. And today we are joined by our very own Dr. Cynthia Miller Idriss, professor of school in our School of Education and in our School of Public Affairs. It's really nice to have Cynthia with us today. Let me tell you a little bit about Cynthia and why it is so very timely to have her with us at this moment. Cynthia's work is groundbreaking and is getting much attention because of the recent attack on the nation's capital, where white supremacist groups and hate groups overtly identified themselves and led the mob attack. Dr. Miller Idriss's research covers the examination of the radical right and extreme youth cultures. She is currently Director of Research at the Center for University Excellence and also the Director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL, both of those centers and lab here at American University. She is also Director of Strategy and Partnerships at the UK-based Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, and she serves on the International Advisory Board of the Center for Research on Extremism in Oslo, Norway. And it's not uncommon to see Cynthia on numerous news programs and shows where she serves as an expert panelist regarding groups, extremism groups, and youth. We are so happy again to have Dr. Miller Idriss with us today, and I just can't wait to have this conversation with her to find out what she believes is the future of education, particularly within the context of her research. Before we jump in though, I want to remind everyone that Dr. Emily Morris, Director of our International Training and Education Program, or what we affectionately call ITEP, will facilitate our Q&A portion starting around 5:30. We're thrilled to have Dr. Morris join us this evening as well. And just a couple of housekeeping notes. There is no chat feature, as you can see within your Zoom portal, and no video or audio features. Questions have already been gathered at the time of registration, so there are no live question and answers tonight, just questions from the audience from registration. The event will be recorded and available on our School of Education YouTube page. So without further ado and delay, good evening, Cynthia. How are you?
Finding the unmute button. Thanks, I'm fine, Cheryl. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here and great to see you.
It's great seeing you. Now let's just hop in. I've been waiting all day to ask this question. And in my introduction, I mentioned far right, I mentioned extremism groups. We have all of these different labels to categorize white supremacy groups. Can you tell us a little bit, what do we really mean by far right? What is that? And how do we define it? Who's a part of it? Who are the members of these groups?
So I use the term, and thank you again, first of all, for having me. It's great to be here and great to see Emily's face and your face and Ashley and be back in the School of Ed. And sorry that I can't be there in person, and hopefully again someday. So I use the term far right. I describe it in my book as the best bad term we have that's available to capture a range of things that are happening that usually far right groups share four categories of things, four elements. So one is some sort of anti-government, anti-democratic ideas. They don't protect minority rights, or they don't, protect freedom of speech or the right to assemble, or promote authoritarianism, for example. The second is hierarchies of exclusionary beliefs about superiority and inferiority, and that's typical in the US to be expressed as white supremacy, but also we see male supremacy, Christian supremacy, we see Western supremacy, these new Western supremacist groups who are called themselves Western chauvinists, for example. And then the third and fourth categories are, one is a commitment to kind of conspiracy theories and fantasies about an existential threat. So it's not just exclusionary ideas, hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, but positioning the other as posing an existential threat to oneself, the us versus them, that this other group's existence creates a dire threat that puts one's own group at an existential threat level. And then that is often expressed through conspiracy theories about demographic replacement or Soros funding a migrant caravan, for example, all different kinds of ideas about orchestration that I can talk about. But the fourth part of it is the commitment to use violence to achieve change. And within the far right spectrum, there's a range. Some groups do not espouse violence, others do. So not every group believes in all four elements of these the same, but they share overlaps. But at the most extreme fringe, they not only believe that violence is an acceptable means to an end, but is the preferred means to bring about a kind of what we call acceleration toward the end times, and then a rebirth into a new white civilization. So that's the kind of far right fringe. And what we saw on something like January 6th is a real toxic mix of groups from across that spectrum. So the anti-government groups, the conspiracy groups, the white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups, you have incel, misogynist, anti-feminist groups. You know, there's a range of groups that we would see showing up. And normally they're quite fragmented and characterized by a lot of infighting. But this really was a moment of a coalition, a loose kind of coalition forming on that day.
The Biden administration has categorized these groups as violent domestic extremism. What about that term? Are you comfortable?
Yeah, nobody can agree on the terms, right? So there's no agency, the State Department uses a different term from DHS, which uses a different term than the Justice Department. And now Biden administration is settling on DVE, domestic violent extremism. That allows the administration to get away from the issue of right versus left, and also allows for the possibility of including left-wing violent groups in that spectrum. So whether that's radical, environmental extremists groups or Antifa type or anarchist groups, the domestic violent extremism is a bigger umbrella. And I think, DHS has, in October of 2020, DHS for the first time said in their threat assessment that domestic violent extremists are the biggest threat facing the nation. And within that subset, white supremacist extremists are the most lethal and most dangerous part of that spectrum. So the domestic violent extremism is a bigger umbrella, and in some ways it makes sense, but I think it also makes sense to recognize where the threat assessment lies and where the lethality lies and where resources should be directed.
So it was interesting because this, one thing that I was really surprised by on January 6th on some of the news shows was that there is no quote unquote law around domestic terrorism. So the legal issues of how these groups would be managed or how law would be enforced is quite fuzzy. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have complicated thoughts about the issue of the legality, and I'm glad that I'm not a lawyer, to be honest, in terms of actually deciding, what the right tools are to prosecute. On the one hand, we of course need accountability, and there are lots of claims out there that say we do have sufficient existing tools, they're just not applied right. And people who are expressing concerns, the ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, expressing concerns, for example, that adding new tools could open up abuses against other groups in the future, and administration gets to decide more broadly who constitutes domestic terrorism, that we're better off using existing tools and protecting civil rights, and being wary of the abuses, particularly in post 9/11 era, when international terrorism laws were used, or could be applied, let's say, against perceived threats to the homeland from domestic citizens, from citizens here who are Muslim, that the concern about applying that, to broader groups in ways that could discriminate, I think, is a valid one. So I have concerns about the expansion. I think for me, I understand the desire to create more transparency in the tools across states. And I think we need more communication across states about how those statutes get defined within the states. That there is no federal statute is, problematic in its own way. But I think being very careful about the protection of civil rights as we move forward and thinking about what it might mean to let some future administration then be able to use those tools against citizens in ways that they can't right now is something that we have to really consider. So, and again, back for me, my main concern is, as an educator, I think that all of the law enforcement and surveillance questions essentially at the far end of the spectrum are essentially a Band-Aid that don't actually address the bigger problem, which is how do we prevent people from, getting recruited and radicalized into these groups to begin with. So, I'm glad somebody's thinking about those issues and I will continue to raise them, but I sort of feel like those are questions that direct resources toward the carceral solutions and the, kind of more law enforcement, more resources. So we have more water bottle restrictions as we go on planes or whatever the equivalent of that is, more securitization of our cities and less about the kind of mental health and educational needs that might prevent us from getting there in the first place.
Right. So were you surprised by January 6th that there, were you expecting this to happen at some point? Or, there were so many people we were surprised to see the overtness of the.
I think every expert I know was expecting something to happen between the election and the inauguration. And as the weeks went by and there wasn't something, all of us, even me, was I maybe being alarmist by saying that? We were all saying, I think, couldn't sleep at night, really worried about what we were seeing online, what we were hearing, what the assessments looked like. And so I wasn't surprised at all. I was, it was infuriatingly predictable, but I think it was also still shocking. This is the city I live in, to see those images. It was shocking, and it was shocking that knowing that there was sufficient intelligence days in advance, weeks in advance, even, that were warning about the chatter that wasn't taken seriously. It really was a tremendous failure on the law enforcement side in very frustrating ways.
Yeah. So, this is a school of education and big ideas. And, given that this is such a timely and critical issue in general, I'm just wondering, what are some of your thoughts about youth, particularly school age youth, and what makes them so vulnerable possibly to joining these types of groups? And what can educators do to help, possibly lessen the vulnerability of some students to want to join such groups?
Well, I could say a lot here, so I'll try to keep my thoughts.
That's your book, right?
Right, exactly. So there's a whole book on that. And one of the things I'm really pleased about this book is that there's a discussion guide that's been commissioned by another organization that works with teachers. The discussion guide being created, I won't name it because it's not public yet, but that guide is now being written, has been written, I've already seen the draft, for teachers to be able to use the book in classrooms and in teacher trainings. And I just heard that as long, one post review, that the paperback edition of the book will include that guide for teachers in the back of it. So, so hopefully the book will also be really accessible and be able to be used in that way for teachers. I think there's a couple different things to know. One is, I think there's a tremendous need for awareness among teachers in training, educators, faculty, just about what modern far-right extremism and white supremacist extremism even looks like. And so, just this weekend, the acting police chief in DC announced that they were going to investigate extremism among the ranks. And the reaction from the union, the police union president, was sort of something like, we don't have a problem with this. There aren't tons of people running around with Ku Klux Klan hoods. If there were, we would know it. You can't hide this stuff. And I think I've never heard a more wrong statement about modern far-right extremism in my life. And it just is. That's the exact opposite of what's happening. They are hiding it. They are coding it, cloaking it in humorous, witty memes, in Holocaust denial and minimization jokes, in dehumanizing racist images that convey extremist ideas that help introduce young people to them. It's coming across for kids as young as 8 on Roblox. 23% of online gamers will encounter this while gaming, white supremacist propaganda. You see it on your college campuses, all across the country. We've had an almost doubling of white supremacist propaganda just in the paper flyers over the last year, according to the Anti-Defamation League.
What are some of those symbols? I mean, what are
so you'll have symbols like a lot of coding of symbols. You'll see things like the boogaloo, of course, which you've seen now on the far right, the anti-government side, which was a joke created by teenagers about a 1984 breakdancing movie, and then gets for a long, complicated youth cultural meme creation thing, turns into a coded symbol for a second civil war. And then because it sounds like Big Luau, somebody adopts it as Big Luau, then they start wearing Hawaiian shirts. So you see Hawaiian shirts, at these kind of protests, right? You see Pepe the Frog get co-opted by the so-called alt-right several years ago, and then gradually through a long and complicated series of memes morph into a flag of Kekistan, which is connected back to Pepe, a mythical land for white supremacists. And that flag was pictured at the Capitol on January 6th. It was at Charlottesville, right? So you see these kinds of symbols all over. I've seen it in images from Brazil, Australia, other places in the world as well. And so it becomes global, those kinds of fantasy images of some sort of white ethno state, a mythical white supremacist land. And so those, that police chief is not going to recognize those symbols. So neither would a teacher necessarily, right? And so some of this is just educating people. What does modern extremism look like? How would you understand what these symbols and codes, a distributor that sells clothing that has, the 2YT for you, which if you sound it out loud, it says too white for you, right? That's their website, right? So this coded kinds of symbols that teachers or adults, parents might not recognize the comments that they say. And so on the one hand, it's just recognizing and understanding, that I saw that symbol and what do I do about it now? And knowing that there are places to go for resources. But it's also understanding what some of those drivers are, so youth are more vulnerable in a moment when they're looking for identity. They are, they're more prone to take risks. And, and they're in a moment in a pandemic, we know for adults as well, there are lots of well-documented examples of where the kind of precariousness and lack of control makes people, white people in this case, more susceptible to some of that language about a threat, right? An existential threat. And so how do those vulnerabilities to propaganda, to misinformation, to conspiracy theories about where the virus comes from, or, translate into anti-Asian violence, for example, as we've seen, just astronomical numbers of anti-Asian violence this year. So those are the kinds of things that happen. And for youth, they're just even more vulnerable. Although I will say that under the pandemic conditions, we've seen a lot more adults radicalizing than you typically see. So the QAnon conspiracy theory in particular has seen a ton of women and a ton of adults, millions radicalizing in an older age frame than we're used to.
Wow. That is just unbelievable. And the need for more education in this area. You mentioned teachers, but would you think that, how does mental health play in this? Do you think that school counselors and others in the schools are just as important as far as the education gap is around this area?
At least as, maybe even more important, because I think that teachers, I wouldn't say more important, but at least as important, because teachers are getting some attention in this space, but mental health counselors and school counselors in particular are still very much ignored. So one of the things I'm really proud of is with the Southern Poverty Law Center, we have a foundational partnership, and we've been creating guides and tools for practitioners that kind of translate the research. So our first one that came out last year was for parents and caregivers. But we now finished a series of focus groups with teachers and then with school counselors and mental health practitioners for the next 2. And then one after that is for coaches, who are also really important. Coaches sometimes will recognize red flags before other people. They see kids in a particular environment, they are able to recognize things. And so school counselors and mental health practitioners, they get very little training on this. And one of the things we've seen really heartbreakingly are that you often have cases where parents once there's a kid who's so far down the radicalization pathway that their parents start to think about taking them to therapy, that is pretty far down, right? It's usually a pretty extreme case. And we've heard stories of parents just taking therapist after therapist after therapist, and therapists don't know what to do. They're not trained, and they don't know what to do about it. And they also might not recognize early signs or even some of those drivers or warning signs. And so we think that, this 360 approach in my lab and with the partnership with SPLC, that part of what we're trying to do is train communities as a whole to better look out both for vulnerabilities among kids who might be radicalized to this, but also for the victims of hate. And so having a kind of victim-centered perspective is really important on that, so that you're not just directing more and more resources toward those who perpetrate hate, but really toward healing communities as a whole.
Yeah, that's a part of that's your big idea right there, right? If we could change some of the training of counselors, teachers, school leaders, parents, about increasing the amount of knowledge and awareness. And you're even talking about skill level and knowing how to work with students who are most vulnerable for these groups. Are there any factors, like, with my school counselor hat on, should I be looking for certain kids that are the most vulnerable? Who would be that kid in the school that would be like at risk for this?
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard, it's like school shootings in the sense of there's no real formula, but there is a kind of toxic mix of elements that you often see. So in some combination, one is social isolation. And so kids who are not connected to other groups of kids are often very vulnerable to the allure of groups who promise them a sense of belonging, of brotherhood, a place to enact meaning and make a difference. They think then their lives will have purpose. And a lot of what we hear at the far end of the spectrum, once kids are very radicalized, and in the worst case, terrorist extremists, I mean, they believe they're martyrs to a cause at this point. They think they're being heroic and saving their own people. And so, but that's how it starts, with these promises of brotherhood and belonging. And you'll hear kids say things like they felt like they had a family, or people really had their back. And so kids who are socially isolated become more vulnerable. Kids who lack a sense of control, kids sometimes who have been bullied, and because then it gives them a sense of power over others, and kids who have not grown up in an environment, either at school or at home, where there's explicit discussions about racial inequality. I think in terms, not just the colorblind, everybody's equal, but conversations about understanding racial discrimination and racism as a whole, including structural racism, so that they're not offered other explanations online when they encounter those other explanations online for racial differences that they might observe in the world, that they recognize those explanations as propaganda, right? Instead of taking that to be the explanation, since they've never received one for what causes differences across socioeconomic levels or something. So those are some of the kinds of things that we see. And then, kids are also attracted as a space to rebel and to express anger. And so not in every case, but in a lot of cases, there has been some kind of trauma at the extreme fringe. And trauma can mean a lot of things, right? Trauma can be going through the pandemic to some extent, but we have seen, histories of assault and bullying, and kids who then, that becomes an opportunity to lash out in other ways. And so, or to find a place where they can express anger and a sense of betrayal at adults who they feel have let them down. And so those tend to be the kinds of things that contribute to more vulnerability and susceptibility to certain kinds of propaganda, misinformation, and recruitment online.
Right. Because I know we're getting short on time, and I could talk to you about this forever. I mean, it's a lot to take in, and lots of questions. But if you had to sum this up, because I see this as being a part of the anti-racist work, anti-racist practice, if you will, in education, would be inclusive of your scholarship and your research. What would you like to see happen in education schools related to your research?
Well, I think that, I think we have to see this as what I call pre-preventative, right? You can't just see extremism and kids who engage in extremism as sort of a tumor that can be like cut out, isolated, eradicated them put in prison, that's the way to solve it. It has to be treated more like a virus, and I promise this was a metaphor I was making, before the pandemic, but, in the sense that we have to create, more inoculation kinds of approaches, and anti-racism is key to that inoculation, I think, in terms of what I was talking about before with, having a deeper understanding of social injustice, of structural and systemic racism, puts everybody in a better position to recognize propaganda for what it is, right? To recognize those memes for what they are. If you have a historical understanding of the Holocaust, you're more likely to recognize those Holocaust memes for the offensive memes and dehumanizing memes that they are, right? Instead of just thinking they're a joke, or like strangely, a terribly high percentage of American kids, just think that the Holocaust didn't happen, or think it was exaggerated, right? So there's education is at every level here important for better recognizing what's out there. The assumption I think you have to make is that kids are going to encounter it. So if you assume every kid is going to encounter this, either as a victim of hate online or as a potential perpetrator of it, or somebody who's vulnerable to it, to those calls for male supremacy and misogyny, or those calls for Western hegemony, or those calls for white supremacy, that they might be vulnerable to it as a member of one of those groups. If you recognize that, then you think, okay, well, we wouldn't just send kids out, where there were a lot of predators to a park and let them go roam around free, but we're going to put 12-year-olds on the internet all day and not prepare them for it. You start to realize it seems kind of absurd, right? That this has to be an education and mental health approach. It can't be just one that we wait until things get so bad and then, and then kids end up in juvenile detention. Basically it's what happens. And so, I think on every level, it has to be education.
Education and mental health, I hear you. Are so important. Hate in the Homeland, your new book, congratulations. I hope everyone out there that's listening and that is just as intrigued by this area of scholarship and will go out and get it and read up. I'm going to turn it over now we have questions from many of our attendees today. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Morris, who will facilitate that discussion. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you, Cheryl.
I'll turn it over to Dr. Emily Morris.
Thank you. Great to see you. Thanks for the questions.
Thanks, Dean. And Dr. Miller Idriss, it's so great to be with you as a faculty of the International Training and Education Program. And as having served as the program director, we're grateful for all that you've done for our students, and for being with us today to talk about some of your work. And as true International Training and Education Program style, these are questions from the students and the audience. And the first question is really to talk about the global, and how does your work build on or break from prevailing understandings of far-right extremism in the United States and globally?
Well, I think one of the things people know me for now in the field is bringing a global perspective to something that for too long has been thought of as something that's just domestic. And it's another one of the reasons I didn't say, to Cheryl, but I don't really like the term domestic violent extremism, or even just domestic extremism, because I think it just, same reason I don't like white nationalism as a term. I use white supremacist extremism because I think these terms make it seem like something is just domestic and not internationally connected. And in fact, the UN Counterterrorism Committee, which was created after 9/11 on the Security Council, I had a briefing in the fall, which I had a chance to provide some materials for and speak to. And it was, I think, the first time that they had taken up the issue of far-right or white supremacist or right-wing terrorism or extremism, whatever term. I think they were using the term right-wing extremism in that context. They had never taken it up before. And the reason why is because the UN has considered it essentially to be a domestic problem of member states and not something that the UN would have a mandate to engage in. And I think that's really changing because we now understand the kind of live streaming, the kind of connections online, the crowdsourcing of funds of terrorist acts across borders, the fact that the last two terrorist attacks in Germany, for example, were live streamed in English or had their manifestos written in English, even though those were native Germans. I mean, they were performing for a global audience. That in August of 2020, there was an attempt by several hundred extremists to storm the German parliament, which made it through the first cordon of police before they were thwarted at the top of the stairs. And that was a very close call by violent extremists who used a mobilized mob of a backdrop of 40,000 people, conspiracy theorists really who'd gathered. I mean, very similar in many ways to what happened ultimately on January 6th, except for the January 6th attack was successful. So I think you see these common threads, the attack on the plot against the Michigan governor following the assassination of a German politician and the assassination of a British politician for being pro-migrant. I mean, you see these similar kinds of things happening globally, and it becomes clear that these are not just the domestic problems of member states.
Thank you. And to build on that, have we really taken the moment and the time to really understand from the global? Do you feel, I know in your book, you really end with a conversation on lessons from elsewhere. And
yeah.
Kind of guidance and thoughts do you have on how we can learn better from the global?
Well, I think the short answer to that is no, but I think that the winds are changing just a little bit. And, you know, so I've been invited several times recently, including 2 recent pieces for Foreign Affairs, to write about what we can learn from the German approach. And the last one was German, Norway, and New Zealand approaches. You know, these are, you know, opportunities to make sure it's clear that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that hasn't trickled down, I think, into the ways that policies are made or the discussions among most policymakers in the States. But I do think that's changing. I think that we're at a moment when it's clear that there's a lot more learning to be done from the global and from the international. But, you know, there haven't been a lot of experts who, other than communicating at the level of counterterrorism, which again is back into the law enforcement side of things, there hasn't been a lot of conversation across on the intervention side or on the prevention side or the education and mental health and social work sides. I mean, I think I'm one of the only people I know that has those conversations. I mean, they're changing, you know, so another group, Moonshot CVE, which does great work in this space in the UK, is now opening up a DC office this week. I think, you know, we start to see little inklings that there's going to be more at least cross-Atlantic conversation, if not global. So I think it's changing.
I want to ask, as you know, School of Education is dedicated to promoting anti-racism. And I want to ask you, do you situate your work as anti-racist? Do you see your work as anti-racist? And could you make that connection for us, if so?
Yeah, I think getting back to sort of the way that I talked about it to Dean Holcomb-McCoy, I think I see preventing extremist radicalization and promoting anti-racist approaches as 2 sides of the same coin. And one of the concerns that I've had, even about the Biden administration right now, you know, they had this very welcome initiative on combating white supremacy itself, which is, you know, about building more equity and countering discrimination, and have announced those plans, and then separately have a whole initiative on countering domestic violent extremism. But as far as I can tell, there's no indication that those groups are talking to each other. And I think that's a mistake, because we start to, we separate those things and think, you know, one is countering the violent extremist fringes once they develop, and the other is focused on building equity and countering discrimination, but without really connecting what happens to when the extremist fringe kind of mobilizes from within that. And so I don't think we should approach prevention of radicalization without doing it from an anti-racist perspective. And that includes reflecting ourselves on the ways and making sure, again, that this is victim-centered work, and that that we're not just putting additional resources into what one of my colleagues called, you know, fixing white kids. Like, isn't that, you know, are you just fixing white kids? And I think that that is an important check on, you know, what we're all doing, make sure that the resources are not going to the most privileged, but that this is about, you know, healing and building entire communities that are not that in ways that respond to the needs of victims. So I see that all as anti-racist work in progress, but I think that I also see it as conversations that haven't been adequately brought together either on this campus or in the country, or certainly not globally.
And building on that, how do you think, or what from your research and your experience as an educator, how do you think we can better have these conversations and do this work in higher education and across universities? So we've talked a little bit about the K-12 space, but how do we do that also within higher education?
I think that, well, one, if there are any funders out there, I think that it would be great for funders to step up into this space and incentivize it, because I will say, you know, the lab that I created is only a year old and we've been really busy, but completely opportunistically. It's just very difficult to take the time to have strategic conversations about how to do this when I now have people whose salary depend on me raising money. And so, you know, I'm basically just constantly pursuing like what will support the next work. And it's a lot of grant-based work that you have to write proposals for, and then whatever gets funded is what you do. So in other words, we don't always have the opportunity to be as strategic or as thoughtful about how things could be stitched together as I would like. So I have my own vision for things, but then we have to map that vision onto the reality of what's there and what funding is there. And the reality is that the funding streams, like the policy streams, have been kept totally separate. And so it's been a challenge. I think that's something where I think individual donors can really make a big difference, stepping up, endowing work, or reaching out to encourage collaboration across sectors. And I think the university is really a fantastic place to start doing this for students, within faculty, with the kind of training, with the kind of residential communities that we already have. But again, you know, sort of where does that support come from in order to make sure that a team that is totally self-funded at this point can continue that work? And that's just the reality that bumps up against the reality. So vision meets reality for a start, essentially what is a startup entrepreneurial kind of entity like my lab.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's hope for more funding for this work going forward.
Exactly. That was just a little plea out there if anybody has any checkbooks. So, yeah.
Excellent. There were a number of questions from the student on social media and media and the culpability and the responsibility of media. And I know a lot of your work, and in your book, you talk about different kinds of spaces in media, from social media to gaming to other virtual meeting places. Can you speak a little bit about what you see the responsibility and or culpability of these companies and media spaces?
Well, this is a huge question that I think is going to probably, the answer to this is going to have to change over the next 4 years. The answer right now is there's really zero accountability from within the social media world and within the tech companies who essentially, you know, are released from liability by the law for the content that users generate. And there's a very controversial set of discussions around that legal, it's called Section 230. People have probably followed it, about whether technology companies should be held accountable. I don't know the answer to that. I know that by the time we get to the stage that we're talking about that, it's already so late that it's very similar to the kind of law enforcement discussion. So most of my work is at the before you get to that, like, let's not have to talk about the moderation. The moderation that happened starting in late, 2020 and 2021 is great to prevent the spread of disinformation. It has helped, but it's late. And essentially part of that problem is that every time you deplatform or moderate, new spaces crop up immediately to fill that gap. So my view is it's a little bit like a whack-a-mole, and again, sort of the Band-Aid problem of rather than addressing this at its root, we end up addressing what happens at its outcome, and putting a ton of resources into the militarization of the city and all those other kinds of things that happened. But on the other hand, I recognize that deplatforming has made a difference. It has made it harder for these groups to fundraise. It has made it harder for them to communicate, it has made it harder for them to travel, to see each other. I mean, all the kinds of legal restrictions on social media and on their movements matter. Designation of them as terrorist groups or not, these things do matter. And so I don't want to be Pollyannish about those very real policies. But I do think that I think at some point we're going to have to face some kind of regulation of those tech companies, which again is not my area of expertise, but it's hard to imagine that we can continue going this way where where moderation only comes once things reach a breaking point.
And thinking about kind of the narratives and what you've talked about as sort of co-opting of images and narratives by the alt-right, we have a question also about how the narrative was switched, not just by lawmakers and media, but also from the blame of who was to blame for the Capitol, and shifting it from the alt-right to other groups such as Antifa and Black Lives Matters. Can you say a little bit about how that narrative has been flipped and what can be done to push back against that narrative flipping?
Well, I think this is where, the question about misinformation and disinformation and how it circulates becomes so important. So, one of the first things I did in the days after, after January 6th was talk to somebody who really tracks this stuff, who I would rely on at the tracking level of written with. And I just said, before I start answering this question, which I know is coming from the media, like, is there any evidence whatsoever? Like, are we seeing anything here that suggests that anybody else was involved, from left-wing groups? And there was none. And that person told me, no, there's zero evidence. And so that's what I'm leaning into, is what the evidence shows from reliable experts and academics who I trust to have scraped that data and to see and to know what was out there online and what was being circulated and what we've seen. That's been repeatedly stated, that there's no evidence of any systematic engagement, of any widespread engagement by anyone else other than these groups across the far right spectrum. And so I think we just have to lean into the evidence, and these are the facts, and lean into that. And when you still see people and hear people, whether that's your uncle at the dinner table or your parents over Zoom or whoever it is that you encounter out there who's saying that, know that they're encountering false information and misinformation and disinformation out there. And that can be very difficult to combat, but providing them with accurate and unbiased sources of information might be a helpful thing to do.
Excellent. And looking a little bit now at gender, we have a question on, and I know in your work you say you don't have a specific chapter on gender, but gender is woven all the way through.
Yeah.
About masculinity, you talk about toxic masculinity, but you also talk about what you call the softer role of women in different spaces and places. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the gender piece and what kind of gaps have emerged through your research, and you feel like we need to still dig a little bit deeper in terms of gender.
So one of the things that, and you're right, I wrote in this book, in response really to a reviewer and a reader who said that, I'm surprised you didn't have a chapter on gender in the book. And because I had previously written a book and I had a chapter on gender, and here's my chapter on toxic masculinity and misogyny, and one of the things I felt was that kind of bounds it, and it's as if like, here's the place where we're going to talk about gender, and then the rest of the time you can just focus on the rest of the far right. But if you look carefully at each of the topics I talk about in the book, each one of them is gendered. And so gender is and misogyny and toxic masculinity are part of the whole thing. They're part of the way that harassment works online in these toxic communities. They're part of the softer ways that women are drawn in and talk to about kind of the purity of food and cooking and raising white families, and about how men are marketed to with language around brotherhood and heroism and being strong and a fighter, and being disciplined, the kind of soldier type language. And so it shows up across the board. And so I think, I have seen a real change I spent a lot of time in the media, and so for a long time, the last question I get from a journalist is, is there anything else I'm missing, right? And so I'd always say, well, I think it would be great to talk about misogyny and add the toxic masculinity piece of that. And at some point, like over the last several months, that question would come up on its own. And I think that that's a real shift in what we've seen. And I think people started to realize, at least around the time of the Michigan kidnapping plot and the kind of misogynistic language, the awful misogynistic language that was used in those arrest reports, you can see the way they talk about the governor, which is different from the way that other kidnapping plots, raise. I mean, just the language of the way they talk about grabbing her and what they're going to do. shows how much misogyny is kind of baked in. And then, repeated cases of domestic violence and its connections to extremist movements across the ideological spectrum also, I think, have started to show us that there are problems with, there are some precursors that kind of indicate maybe some violent, potential violent outcomes. So there are still a lot of gaps, but I think at least attention to the issue is starting to shift. Also, finally, I'll say the incel violence, which is involuntary celibate violence or male supremacist violence against sort of anti-feminism, that finally is being acknowledged as part of the far right spectrum. Not everywhere, but for a long time, it was just seen as sort of personality problems of men who couldn't get a girlfriend or whatever. And I think finally starting to see that as anti-woman hate is new and is starting to be seen as part of that spectrum of domestic violence, violent extremism.
Are there, in addition to those gaps, if you had unlimited check funding opportunities, are there other gaps that you would add to kind of that need more research and really need further exploration?
I mean, the biggest one is the military and the veteran communities, and as well as law enforcement in terms of their engagement in the far right spectrum, the anti-government extremist spectrum, and the white supremacist spectrum. I think that, again, we're in the midst of what is really a sea change to have the Secretary of Defense order a stand down. I mean, that's historic. We now have a historic stand down order. So over the next 60 days, there'll be multiple stand downs in every military unit, every agency, every command is going to have to at least spend a few hours having some kind of training and talking about what extremism is, what domestic extremism is, how you recognize hate. We're seeing executive orders from mayors. We're seeing, orders from governors to order trainings of police on anti-bias and countering extremism and recognition of extremism work. So we're in a moment of, all of which I know because of the kinds of floods of requests that we get in the lab to assist, which we can't do everything or do all of it, but there's, a tremendous need out there for this kind of work. And I think this is a moment for educators and for folks who understand training to really be highly engaged in it. And so I would say there's a gap in the capacity of this country to have the resources to train everybody who needs to be trained, from the educators and teachers and school counselors and mental health folks all the way up to the military. On the research side, there are big gaps in what we know from about whether we're talking about a few bad apples or a systematic problem on the military and law enforcement. And that's because there's been no transparency or data collection, which I think is not news to anybody, but we just haven't had it. And I think we will now have data collection for the first time because of the new provision in the NDAA. It's just one question that's going to require some assessment, but I do think the data, the disproportionate number of veterans involved in January 6th is going to start to change these conversations and start to open up the possibilities of really for researchers to dig in a little bit more and see both what are the roots of the problem and what could be done.
Great. And I'm going to, I know we just have a few minutes left, time for a few more questions. There is a question that I'll take from the Q&A and link to another question from some of the students and the audience. So it's a question going back to what we talked about at the beginning and the global and the local. And Ibrahim Kendi said in an interview a few weeks ago that race and racism is simultaneously global and national and local, right? And so the question is really, we've talked about sort of what we can learn. We have a question that digs deeper into what can we also learn from anti-colonial struggles in the fight against white supremacy, and how do we, as the US, recognize and learn from these nuances, but also be sure to create these nuances so that we're not also imposing on outside of the US our notions and our own experiences on other struggles.
Yeah. So I think there's lots of different aspects of that. I mean, one of the things I think it's important to, it should be self-understood that, and I say this speaking to my colleagues across the, who work on terrorism and extremism, but it should be self-understood for those of us who work in the field that, of course, like white supremacist extremism itself rests on a foundation of white supremacy. But I think for a long time, that just wasn't acknowledged or talked about, right? So this is an extremist fringe and a terrorist fringe, but not related to the fact that we have, structural white supremacist legacies in the, in the country, right? In terms of who could buy a house or segregation or, all the kinds of things that we know exist with structural racism. So that's part of that stitching together that I was talking about needing to bring together the conversations around white supremacy and the combating of extremism that seem to happen in totally different spheres and I think need to be brought together in much greater detail. And I would say the same thing with the kind of, when you're talking about anti-colonial struggles and the, what we don't want is like after 9/11, in a lot of places around the world, especially sort of sub-Saharan Africa and other places, there was this almost like an incentive to declare rebel groups like terrorist groups, right? You had these like, there's this new anti-terrorist regime happening. And so, in the US, and so to gain favor, you had this whole new relabeling happening across the globe. And I, saw that happening in action at that time. And I think, I think we just have to be really sensitive to the dynamics and to not kind of impose what the legacies are in this country with what the legacies are overseas in different places. And at the same time, recognize that there's a ton of Holocaust denial and Holocaust minimization going on in this country, for example, even though the legacy of the Holocaust is Germany's. And so Germany has to grapple with that and deal with that as its own legacy, but it has contributed and helps contribute to these global anti-Semitic narratives that really fuel a lot of violent white supremacy in this country. And in the same way, the US has been a major exporter of white supremacist extremist ideas and ideologies to Europe in particular through music in the 1980s and 90s, right-wing rock music and others, and now through the creation of sort of means and technology spaces and online gaming channels and platforms that enable a lot of this and create spaces and groups that then connect and promote and connect with others overseas. So there's a lot of back and forth, but I absolutely agree. I mean, there's no copying either. I think we can't just wholesale adopt the strategies of other countries, but understand like what are the principles behind the approaches that's happened in Germany. And I think one of those principles is a whole of society approach and a lot more attention to social work and the theater and the arts and to teachers and to combating extremism, all within a charge of protecting and building democracy. And I don't think we have seen it that way. It's like, what does it take, for everyone? This is what I said in the conclusion to the book, like, what would it take for everyone to feel at home in the country where they live? And, those are the kind of simple questions that I feel like we need to ask and then sort of figure out where we stand and how we can move forward. So I don't know if that was a complete answer to it, but it's trying to get it down in a minute.
Great. And I wanted to ask one last question, bringing it back to the School of Ed and bringing it back to the students and the faculty at American University. And for those students that are engaged and trying to find their space in this struggle against extremism and trying to understand and be a part of anti-racism, what kind of advice and thoughts and insights from doing this work do you have for our students and our faculty and others that are aspiring to be a part of this struggle?
I think, I think there are lots of different things I could say here. So one is, I think, recognizing that every single individual has a role to play, just like every single individual has a role to play in the anti-racist struggle and in anti-racist practice on an everyday, and should be getting better and trying harder at it every single day and making it a part of their lives. I think it's the same with countering extremist propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, scapegoating techniques, and to recognize that all of us have growth. So even if you're, feel quite competent in one area, that you might not really be, there might be other areas where you're not recognizing the way that some of those jokes might have, say, anti-Semitic tinges to it or Islamophobic tinges to it, or something that you're not kind of fully recognizing, that some of the misogyny gets promoted by people who might otherwise never say something that would be offensive in another context, but can be in the joke format in particular, because there's a lot of humor and irony and satire and wit used in the youth culture kind of approach to weaponizing youth culture, I guess is the way I would describe it in far-right extremism. So I think every single person has a place to play, and And especially as it relates to young people, which are the folks that I'm most interested in, like everybody knows a young person, whether they're a coach or an aunt or an uncle or a cousin, and kind of keeping an eye out. And what are they exposed to online? What apps do they have? Why are they using that encrypted app? If they're online gaming, have a conversation with them. Everyone knows somebody who spends time on an online game needs to have a conversation with them, because they are encountering stuff, I guarantee it. And either they're encountering it as a victim, and where they're, seeing the N-word slur or something awful or being called, or they're encountering it in a way that's exposing them to propaganda, or trying to recruit them into it. And if they're not, then they're lucky. But I think assuming that every young person is going to encounter it is a place to start for knowing how to engage with meaning and purpose, and trying to at least be aware of red flags and know that there are places to go for resources where you can get help.
Thank you. That's great and sound advice. We're out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you again for being with us and having this conversation, and for being a part of our community, and for furthering this important work, but also for writing a book that is so accessible, and not only relevant, but accessible, and for helping turn this into work that can be translated into teacher training and in the classroom. So thanks for helping make that more accessible. Any last thoughts or words of wisdom, or what's next before we do a final close out?
I would just say a couple different things for those who want to know more, including, we have, I will say, our Boogaloo, we did an animated video on the Boogaloo anti-government extremist scenes, which just today got announced as an official selection at the American Documentary Film Festival, which is an Oscar eligible event, which is a really bizarre moment for me, to say that, we have a video that's been, that is now going to be screened out there. But the reason why I raised it is because we just also created an educator's guide to that video, so it can be used as a classroom unit. I taught it in my own class this semester, which is on extremism in education. It's an 11-minute animated video, and it has a multi-page, I have it right here somewhere, educator's guide that has discussion questions and ways to talk about conspiracy theories with young people. We have the parents and caregivers guide. So all of these tools and resources are available on our website, which is www.american.edu/peril, PERIL. And I would just encourage you to check it out and download the resources, share them with teachers know that there are a series of other tools coming from our work with the Southern Poverty Law Center this spring for teachers, for school counselors, mental health professionals, and coaches. Those will all be out, I hope, by April. Also free and downloadable, and we have impact studies coming out on all of them to show how they move the needle and in what ways for different practitioner communities. So stay tuned, check out our tools, and thank you for having me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, and thanks to all the watchers who joined us. This will be posted on, and reach out to us if you have questions, and please join us again for our Big Ideas series, or our Global Education Forum. So you can get more information at the School of Education website. And thanks again to all of the students and audience that have contributed questions and participated virtually. Be well, be healthy, be active.